Long ago, when America still smelled of dust and freedom, men rode the wild trails with nothing but grit and a dream. Cowboys. They drove thousands of head across rivers and deserts, slept under the stars, and ate whatever could survive 1,000 miles. Tonight, we crack open a forgotten chuckbox, 25 forgotten cowboy meals from the Wild West trails. No Hollywood steaks. Just the raw, real food of men on the edge. Saddle up.
Sourdough starter in a tin cup. Picture a dented tin cup swinging from a saddle horn, inside a grayish goo that bubbles like a witch's brew under a merciless sun. That's the Cowboy's sourdough starter, older than most states, carried across 3 territories and guarded closer than gold dust. They said the best starters came from San Francisco in '49, born in the sourdough pots of miners who never struck it rich but struck something better, a living thing that turned water and flour into bread. Cowboys swore their starters held ghosts, some claimed the bubbles carried the breath of dead trail bosses. When a man died on the drive, his cup was poured into the cook's bucket so his spirit rode on in every biscuit. Miss your starter and you missed Christmas, Sundays, and every memory of home. One old wrangler, Texas Jack Morrow, kept his for 42 years. When he finally passed in Abilene, they buried that tin cup with him, still bubbling. Out there on the lone prairie, that sour smell rising through the cold night air was the closest thing to a mother's kitchen most of these boys would ever have again. Hardtack teeth breakers. Hardtack looked innocent, little ivory bricks stamped with government letters, but it was the devil in cracker form. Baked 4 times until every drop of mercy was driven out, it could sit in a wagon for 5 years and still outlast your grandchildren. Boys called them teeth breakers, coffin nails, or sheet iron crackers. The trick was never to bite straight on. You soaked them in coffee until they went soft and wormy looking, or you fried them in bacon grease till they swelled up like angry porcupines. There's a story out of the Red River Drive in '83, a greenhorn bet he could eat 1 drive for $10. He cracked 3 molars, spat blood, and the crew used the broken teeth to play poker the rest of the trip. Yet when the wagon burned and every sack of flour went up in smoke, that despised hardtack kept 15 men alive for 11 days. Men hated it, cursed it, and secretly loved it, because when hardtack was all you had left, you knew you were still breathing. Son of a gun stew. When the crew slaughtered a steer on the trail, the cook rolled up his sleeves and went elbow deep into places polite folks never mention. Everything but the moo went into the pot: heart, liver, sweetbreads, brains, and the mysterious fries that made the boys whistle. Boiled slow with wild onions and a fistful of Arbuckle's coffee grounds to cut the richness, son of a gun stew turned slaughter day into Thanksgiving. The name came from the cook's favorite curse when he burned his hand on the kettle. Old Cookie McBride out of Montana claimed his recipe was whispered to him by a crow woman who vanished the next morning, leaving only a single eagle feather on the wagon seat. Men swore that stew could cure rattlesnake bite, broken hearts, and the mean reds. 1 spoonful and you tasted blood, smoke, and the wild itself. Coffee boiled in a rusty pot. Cowboy coffee wasn't a beverage, it was a sacrament. At 4 in the morning, while the stars still hung low enough to touch, the cook threw a handful of Arbuckles into a pot so black with age it looked like it had buried men. Water came straight from the creek, mud and all. Boiled till it could wake the dead, then settled with a splash of cold water or, if things were desperate, yesterday's grounds. They said if the spoon stood upright you made it right. Passing that single tin cup around the fire was the only church most cowboys ever attended. Legend has it that in the winter of '86 on the XIT, the coffee froze solid in the pot and the hands chipped off chunks to suck on like candy. That brew kept the loneliness from swallowing a man whole. Jerky strips smoked over mesquite. Long before refrigeration, jerky was life folded thin and smoked black. Cowboys sliced lean beef into ribbons, soaked it in brine strong enough to float a horseshoe, then laid it over mesquite coals until it looked like old boot leather. 1 strip could keep a man riding from dawn to dusk. There's a tale about Charlie Goodnight's cook, Bose Eichert, who buried a sack of jerky under a lone cedar on the goodnight-loving trail in case any cowboy ever came back hungry. In 1923 a surveyor found that sack, still edible, still tasting of 1866. That's the kind of immortality mesquite smoke gives a thing. Vinegar pie. Out where lemons were fairy tales, a clever cook discovered that plain old vinegar could pucker your lips and fool your brain into tasting lemon meringue. Butter, sugar, eggs if you were lucky, and a good splash of vinegar went into a crust baked blind in a Dutch oven. When it came out trembling and golden, the whole camp went quiet for one blessed minute. Ma Collins from the Hashkniff outfit was famous for hers. She claimed the recipe came from her great-grandmother who fed Washington's army. Men wrote home about that pie more than they wrote about their sweethearts. Chuck wagon beans with salt pork. The heart of every trail drive beat inside a cast-iron pot no wider than a wagon wheel. 10 pounds of pinto beans, a slab of salt pork white as a preacher's collar, wild onions dug up with a Bowie knife, and enough red pepper to make a grown man cry. The cook let it simmer from dawn till the stars came out, the smell drifting across the bedground like a siren song. They called it Chuck Wagon Symphony, and when that pot finally came off the fire, 15 grown men turned into starving wolves. There's a whispered story from the 1885 Turkey Track Drive. The cook vanished one night, leaving only his hat floating in the beans. Next morning the pot was fuller than when he left, and every hand who ate swore they heard the missing man laughing inside the bubbles. Nobody ever found him, but nobody ever turned down a second bowl either. Some flavors are worth risking your soul for. Fried dough, cowboy donuts. Whenever the cook had a little spare flour and a skillet full of sizzling lard left from rendering the morning's bacon, magic happened. He dropped fist-sized blobs of dough into the fat and they rose like golden suns, crackling and spitting. Sprinkled with precious sugar or drizzled with sorghum, they were gone before the coffee cooled. On the J.A. Ranch in '79, a kid named Willie claimed one of those donuts saved his life. After falling in the Canadian River, half drowned and freezing, the cook shoved a hot donut in his mouth. The boy coughed, opened his eyes, and said, "I just saw heaven, and it tastes like fried dough." From that day on, the crew called them Willie's Resurrection Rings. Some nights, when the wind howls lonely across the panhandle, old hands swear they still smell them frying. Canned tomatoes from the supply wagon. One dented red and white can of tomatoes was worth more than a month's wages out where scurvy turned gums black and teeth loose. When the boss finally cracked one open, the juice ran like liquid rubies and every man lined up with his tin plate held high. The taste exploded, bright, acidic, alive. In 1872 on the Chisholm Trail, a drover named Silas Mercer traded his gold pocket watch for a single can after watching his best friend waste away. He spoon-fed the tomatoes to the dying man under a cottonwood, and damned if the fellow didn't sit up the next morning asking for coffee. They buried the empty can with full honors, lid polished to a mirror. Cowboys are funny about miracles, they'll plant one in the ground like a seed. Arbuckle's coffee with chicory. Every crate of Arbuckles came with a peppermint stick hidden inside, and finding it made you the luckiest Sanofagun on the drive. The coffee itself was dark as sin and twice as bitter, cut with chicory because the company figured cowboys wouldn't notice. They noticed, and they loved it anyway. There's a tale from the Matador outfit that a ghost rider used to appear on moonless nights, riding a pale horse and begging for a cup of Arbuckles. The cook always left one cooling on the wagon tongue. Come morning, the cup was empty and the peppermint stick gone. Nobody ever saw the rider's face, but the tracks always led west, toward the graveyard at Doan's Crossing. Biscuits baked in a Dutch oven. A lid of glowing coals on top, a bed of embers beneath, and inside that black iron cauldron rose the closest thing to an angel's wing a cowboy ever tasted. When the lid came off and the steam rolled out carrying the smell of fresh bread, men forgot sore backsides and wolves and tomorrow's river crossing. Cookie on the XIT claimed his biscuits could float a branding iron, and once proved it by setting one on the creek, it drifted downstream like a tiny golden raft. A photographer caught the moment, and that picture still hangs in the Cowboy Hall of Fame. Some say if you hold a genuine XIT biscuit to your ear on a quiet night, you can hear the longhorns lowing. Molasses, long sweetening. Thick, black, and slow as a politician's promise, molasses came in a 5-gallon can guarded like the payroll. One spoonful turned cornmeal mush into dessert, made coffee bearable, and soothed the throat raw from singing to nervous cattle. In the winter of '86, the Swan Land and Cattle Company got snowed in for 72 days. When flour ran out, the cook kept men alive on molasses and hope. On the last night he poured the final inch into a tin plate, set it in the snow, and it froze solid. They chipped it like candy and swore it tasted like victory. That plate is supposedly nailed above the bar in Cheyenne to this day. Pickled eggs in a jar. The jar lived under the wagon seat, wrapped in a gunny sack so it wouldn't rattle and break a man's heart. Inside floated a dozen eggs, stark white against murky vinegar the color of creek water after a stampede. Peppercorns and a single dried red chili bobbed like tiny warnings. When the cook cracked the lid, the sour smell punched the air and every hand reached for a fork. They were hard as billiard balls and twice as dangerous. One bite and your eyes watered, but you went back for another because that sour shock reminded you that you could still feel something. In 1881 on the Montana-Texas Trail, a kid named Curly Wolf dropped the jar. It shattered. 15 grown men almost lynched him on the spot. The cook saved him by swearing the vinegar soaked into the ground and made the grass grow greener the next spring. To this day, old-timers riding past that spot swear the grass still smells like Easter Sunday. Cornmeal mush with bacon drippings. At 3 a.m., while the night herd circled and the remuda snorted in the dark, the cook stirred a pot of yellow cornmeal so thick the spoon stood like Excalibur. He poured in the morning's bacon grease, golden and still popping, then slapped it into tin plates where it quivered like prairie jelly. It didn't look like much, but that mush stuck to your ribs harder than a winter norther. There's a story from the Hashkniff in '84, a rustler got caught and was sentenced to ride drag for a month eating nothing but mush. After 3 days he broke down crying and confessed every sin he'd ever committed, begging for beans instead. The cook just smiled and added another ladle of grease. They say the confession was so thorough the sheriff let him go just to shut him up. Dried apples, trail apples. Shriveled brown rings tied in a flour sack, smelling of the orchard back in Missouri that most of these boys would never see again. Chew one slow and the sweetness spread like a woman's smile you half remember. On the long northern drives, when snow hid the grass and men started seeing things that weren't there, the cook would pass the sack and say, "Take you a trip home, son." In the terrible winter of '86-'87, the Milk River froze so hard the herd starved, but the crew lived on dried apples and coffee. When spring finally came, they planted the last handful of seeds from those apples. A tree still grows on the banks of the milk, gnarled and stubborn, and every fall the apples taste like tears and hope. Buffalo tongue, delicacy. When the great herd still thundered and a hunter dropped a bull, the tongue was the prize, long, tender, and rich as any delicacy in New York City. Boiled slow, then sliced thin and laid on sourdough with wild horseradish, it tasted like the earth itself had decided to be kind for once. Old man Charlie Reynolds claimed he once fed buffalo tongue to General Custer the night before the Little Bighorn. Custer ate 3 helpings and said it was fit for a king. Reynolds kept the last slice in his pocket for luck. They found it on his body weeks later, still wrapped in oilskin, untouched by wolves or time. Prairie oysters, Rocky Mountain oysters. Out on the open range, spring branding meant smoke, bawling calves, and one of the best-kept secrets in cowboy cooking, prairie oysters, sometimes called Rocky Mountain oysters, though they never saw a tide in their life. After the cutting was done, the cook quietly collected the 2 small treasures each calf left behind. Yes, partner, exactly what you're thinking now, washed them clean in a bucket of creek water, then sliced them thin as a silver dollar. Rolled in seasoned cornmeal and dropped into a skillet of popping hot lard, they came out golden brown, crisp on the outside, tender and creamy within, tasting richer than any seafood from Galveston or Baltimore. The trick was never telling the new boys what they were eating until the plate was empty. One Boston tenderfoot in 84-814 licked his fingers, and begged the cook for the oyster recipe to send back east to his sweetheart. The whole crew laughed so hard they had to sit down in the dust, and the branding tally was short 50 head that day. From then on, every greenhorn got served a generous helping on his first week, just to watch his face when the truth finally dawned. Some jokes, like the prairie itself, are too good to let die. Cactus pads, nopales, grilled. In the waterless stretches of the staked plains, when canteens clanked empty, a wise cowboy sliced the flat pads off prickly pear, shaved the spines with his skinning knife, and threw them on the coals. They hissed, turned bright green to olive, and tasted like lemony green beans kissed by fire. The Mexicans taught the trick, the Comanches perfected it, and the Texans claimed they invented it. One scorching July on the Pecos, a crew owed their lives to nopales when the water wagon broke an axle. They ate cactus till their hands bled from the tiny thorns, but they walked out singing. Some say if you listen close on a hot wind, you can still hear that song. Wild onion and rabbit stew. When the sun bled out across the plains and the herd finally bedded down, some lucky hand would slip off with a .22 and come back with a cottontail or two. The cook tossed them in the pot hole, for singed off over the fire, along with fistfuls of wild onions that grew like green spears after spring rain. The stew bubbled slow, filling the night with a smell that made even the toughest waddy homesick. They say on the 1878 Cheyenne, Deadwood Trail a young drover named Henry Plummer, no relation to the outlaw, shot a rabbit that had a gold nugget in its stomach. The crew ate the stew anyway, picked the gold out of their teeth with jackknife blades, and every man swore that was the sweetest rabbit he ever tasted. The nugget bought whiskey in Deadwood, but the memory bought something money never could. Gingerbread from a tin box. Every Christmas, and sometimes just because a mother's heart couldn't stand the silence, a square tin would show up in the mail sack, dark, moist gingerbread wrapped in wax paper and tied with red string. It traveled 500 miles by stagecoach and another 200 by chuck wagon, yet when the lid came off the cloves and molasses still sang. Men who hadn't cried since they were 6 turned away to hide wet eyes. On the LX Ranch in 1889 a tin arrived addressed to whoever needs it most. Inside was gingerbread and a note in a child's scrawl, "Mama says this keeps angels close." That night a norther blew in so fierce the herd drifted 30 miles. Every man who ate a piece made it back to the wagon alive. They buried the empty tin under the corral gate. Some say the angels still stand watch there. Lye soap, cowboy candy. Once a month the cook boiled beef tallow and lye until it turned into hard white bars that could scour a skillet or a man's hide with equal fury. In hard times, when the flour was gone and the jerky down to dust, hungry hands looked at those bars and remembered the old joke, tastes like chicken if you're hungry enough. In the winter of '87 on the Dakota Badlands, a crew did exactly that. They grated the soap into water, added salt and pepper, and called it soup. The ones who kept it down lived. The ones who didn't, well, the ground was too frozen for burying anyway. Old Cookie Yates carried a half-eaten bar in his vest pocket till the day he died. Said it reminded him never to complain about beans again. Tobacco juice, coffee substitute. When the last Arbuckle's sack was empty and the wind cut like a skinning knife, desperate men turned to the plug. They'd chew Red Horse or Star until their gums bled, then spit the black juice into a tin cup and warm it over the fire. It looked like tar, tasted like regret, and kept the blood moving. There's a story from the '93 Cherokee Strip Run. A rider named Zeke Harlan drank so much tobacco coffee he started seeing his dead brother riding drag beside him. Zeke followed the ghost clean across the line and staked the best claim in the new territory. When the land office asked how he found it, Zeke just spat a stream of brown and said, "Family showed me the way." Pemmican, native gift. Flat bricks of pounded buffalo meat, fat, and chokecherries, wrapped in rawhide and hard as a banker's heart. The Lakota and Cheyenne traded them for coffee and cartridges, and one brick could keep a man alive for days. Cowboys called it Cheyenne chewing gum. In '74 on the Powder River, a half-starved crew bought a single sack from a silent warrior who vanished before they could pay. They ate that pemmican through a blizzard that killed 2,000 head of cattle. When spring came, they found the warrior's frozen body sitting upright against a cottonwood, smiling, with an empty rawhide pouch in his lap. They buried him with full honors and never spoke of the dead again. Skillet cornbread with sorghum. The cook poured yellow cornmeal batter into a screaming hot skillet greased with yesterday's bacon drippings, set it on the coals, and covered it with another skillet for a lid. 10 minutes later the smell of toasting corn and molasses floated across the camp like church bells. When he flipped it out, crisp golden bottom, steaming soft middle, and cut it into wedges, the men drizzled dark sorghum syrup that ran like liquid amber. On the Frying Pan Ranch in '82 a wedding was held between a cowboy and a rancher's daughter. There was no preacher for 50 miles, so they said vows over a skillet of cornbread. The bride kissed the groom with sorghum on her lips, and every hand swore it was the sweetest ceremony Texas ever saw. The last cup of water. At the end of a dry drive, when the creeks turned to cracked mud and the horses rolled their eyes white, the cook rationed the final barrel. 1 tin cup passed hand to hand under a sky cruel as brass. No man took more than a swallow. The last sip always went to the youngest hand, the one who still believed tomorrow would be better. In the summer of 1886 on the Cimarron Cutoff, that cup saved a boy named Temple Houston Abernathy, 14 years old and already tougher than most men twice his age. Years later, when he rode into town as a lawyer, he carried that same dented cup on his saddle. He never drank from anything else. Said it reminded him that every drop of water, every bite of food, every sunrise was borrowed from men who never made it home. These 25 meals weren't just food. They were prayers baked by the sun. Letters written in smoke. Cowboys who never came home, but left their flavor in the story. If you smell mesquite on the wind, if you hear the wagons creak, hit subscribe. We'll meet again at the fire. The America we cherish. Where the past still tastes like home.